Hi, my name's Tom, welcome back to my channel and what will potentially be the first in a new series of videos in which I attempt to provide some accessible introductions to some quote-unquote classic bits of literature. I first floated the idea of this series in a video a couple of months back. I spoke about how I'd been trying to read a little bit more this year and that in doing so I'd come to really value a decent introduction to whatever the book was that I was trying to have a crack at. And I kind of suggested that there might be a space for that kind of thing here on YouTube and that I humbly might be able to have a little go at providing that. And to my genuine surprise, the response to that suggestion was absolutely overwhelmingly positive. And so this is my first crack at making an episode of what I'm tentatively calling, although this might change, how to read it. Obviously, I always really value feedback on my videos, but particularly with this being a kind of pilot episode, that would be particularly useful. Any thoughts on what's good or less good about this video would be amazing. Please do pop those down below in the comments. And as always, if you're new around here and this seems like your kind of thing, then please do consider subscribing. With that out of the way, however, let's take a crack at Ulysses by James Joyce and how to read it. James Joyce's Ulysses has a bit of a reputation. Generally speaking, people have two preconceptions about this book. First, that it is by some metric one of the greatest or at least most significant books ever written, and second, that it is near impossible to read. And in my opinion, the way these two ideas are often paired together is particularly insidious. The sentiment seems to be that this is a book you definitely should have read, and that if you haven't, then it's probably because you're just not quite clever enough. Now, I'm not going to particularly try and critique the first part of that sentiment today. I think it would be pretty hard to argue that Ulysses is not a really important work in literary modernism and has had a big influence on literature ever since. And while I think it is totally a valid opinion to not like it, I certainly really enjoyed the time that I spent with this book. What I do want to attack today is that second idea, that this is in some way a uniquely obtuse and difficult to read book. I'm certainly not going to suggest that there aren't sections which are a little bit challenging and perhaps require some lateral thinking or some guidance to interpret. However, I think that going into reading any book with the notion that it is in some way better than us is kind of setting us up to fail. So today, my aim is to provide some contextual information in terms of themes, a little bit about plot, and some stuff about style, in order that when you go into reading Ulysses, assuming I haven't put you off along the way, that you can feel confident about A, getting to the end, but also B, enjoying or otherwise getting something out of the experience of reading it. So, Ulysses was James Joyce's third novel, following the sublime collection of short stories Dubliners and the semi-autobiographical A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It was first published in 1918 in serialized form in the American literary magazine The Little Review, before being published as a complete novel in 1922 in Europe, and for reasons we'll briefly touch upon later, not until 1933, 11 years later, in America. Like both his previous works, Ulysses is set in Dublin, the city in which James Joyce was born and largely raised. Indeed, this is a book about Dublin as a whole, as a kind of ecosystem, as much as it is about any of the individual characters that walk its streets. However, it was written, like many of his other books, in mainland Europe, a little bit in Paris and a little bit in Zurich, Joyce having left Ireland behind for good in 1912. See, Joyce had a somewhat contested relationship with his home country. As one can tell from reading any of his books, he dearly loved Ireland's people and its culture. However, he felt that it was being fatally held back, in a manner which both stifled the potential of the country as a whole, but also the individuals living within it. At the time, Ireland was still under British rule, and although that regime could be brutally suppressive, Joyce's decision to leave seems to have rested more on the personal limitations that economic subservience to Britain placed upon the life opportunities for an ambitious young middle-class man at the time. As such, after completing his degree at University College Dublin, Joyce left Ireland to study medicine in Paris, something he didn't stick at particularly too long before before dropping out to pursue writing, something which had long been a passion of his. Nevertheless, despite his physical dislocation from it, Dublin, Ireland, and particularly concern with Irishness are weaved throughout Joyce's novels. Sometimes this manifests itself in characters delivering big political speeches on the tyranny of British rule or the overbearance of the Catholic Church in Irish society, but what I'd like to focus mostly on today is the manner in which it reveals itself in the touching, intimate portrayals of the everyday lives of people of Dublin, which permeate throughout Joyce's work. In all his books, but particularly Dubliners and Ulysses, Joyce seeks to celebrate the lives of the ordinary, predominantly lower middle class people of Dublin. He holds up tiny moments of love and laughter, heartbreak and deceit, and by portraying these tiny dramas through literature, holds them up as being ever bit as significant as the great quests of heroes and kings. In Dubliners, he had done so simply through telling these stories through literature, very much following in the realist footsteps of Henrik Ibsen. However, with Ulysses, he decided to go one step further, drawing upon the beautifully unremarkable people of Dublin to undertake a contemporary retelling and loose parody of the Odyssey. The plot of Ulysses is thus very loosely based around that of the Odyssey. In seeking to make this story very much about everyday life rather than epic quests, however, Joyce makes some notable amendments. Where the central figure of the Greek myth is the brave and cunning Odysseus, known to the Romans as Ulysses, hence the title, the hero of Joyce's novel is one Leopold Bloom. Although he has his moments, Bloom is somewhat less assertive than his Homeric counterpart, and despite his eagerness to tell everyone that will listen that he has a first-class degree from the University of Life, he's not always the sharpest tool in the shed. Rather than a warrior king, Bloom is an advertising salesman, and furthermore is treated by most of his friends or acquaintances with either disrespect or outright apathy. Some of this is down to him being half Jewish in a city with a low-key anti-Semitism problem, but part of it is just due to him being just a tiny bit odd. Where Odysseus is a leader of men, then Bloom is very much a perennial outsider. Moreover, Bloom's own Odyssey is far less epic than that of Odysseus's, where the Greek hero sailed for 10 years around the Mediterranean. Bloom's journey is confined to one day wandering the streets of Dublin. And where Odysseus was attempting to get home to a loving and faithful wife, Bloom is largely trying to avoid going home in order not to walk in on his wife starting an affair. See, partly due to their having lost a child, but also largely due to Bloom's strange idiosyncrasies, Molly Bloom has taken to having a series of affairs, and a good proportion of the male characters that we meet throughout the course of Bloom's day have had the pleasure of sleeping with Molly Bloom, something which Leopold is all too aware of, but all too mild-mannered to do anything about. During his attempts to avoid returning home then, Leopold Bloom has a number of encounters, which loosely reflect those which occur in the Odyssey. Here, however, again, the epic is replaced by the ordinary. The terrifying Cyclops becomes replaced by a half-drunk, threatening, and overly dogmatic Irish nationalist in a pub. And where Odysseus, the Greek king, journeys into Hades to seek the wisdom of the dead, Bloom instead goes to the cemetery to attend the funeral of an acquaintance. In all of this, Joyce brings the epic and the heroic into dialogue with the everyday, encouraging us to find the lesser forms of heroism that are undeniably present in everyday life. Leopold Bloom is not the only protagonist of Ulysses, however, with the final chapter, or episode as they're often referred to, focusing on his wife, Molly, and the first 3 being dominated by Stephen Dedalus. Stephen is fairly unashamedly a stand-in for Joyce himself. He is also the protagonist of a portrait of the artist as a young man, and is one of a number of characters from Joyce's earlier works who reappear in Ulysses. Stephen both serves as Ulysses' version of Telemachus, Odysseus' son, but is also heavily influenced by Shakespeare's Hamlet. Ulysses is thus heavily into text textual, with there being numerous references and correspondences to previously existing texts within it. However, I would say that it isn't essential to have a deep or complex understanding of the Odyssey, Hamlet, or any other text in order to read Ulysses. Joyce is far more interested in critiquing the idea of Odysseus, that trope of heroism, than he is particularly in any of the minutiae of either's plot. The main thing that people do find an obstacle to reading Ulysses, however, is its persistently experimental style. In my episode of What the Theory on modernism, I discussed that movement's obsession with formal experimentation. Artists such as Picasso, for example, sought to find new ways to represent the world through art that didn't necessarily seek to directly imitate what the real world looks like. Joyce was himself very much a modernist, and many hold up Ulysses as perhaps the key example of literary modernism. For although continuing the same sequence of events, each chapter or episode does so by engaging a different literary style. Episode 15, Cirque, for example, is written in the form of a stage play, while episode 17, Ithaca, is written as a series of questions and answers. More than just Joyce changing things up on a whim, however, the style in which each episode is written very much reflects the action that's taking place within it. The stream of consciousness style of episode 3, Proteus, for example, very much seeks to reflect Stephen's own wandering thought processes throughout it. And the musical, often onomatopoeic style of Sirens very much seeks to reflect the obsession with music and sounds within that scene. And I find the best way to view these stylistic experiments is simply as them being the result of an author having fun with seeing what they can do on the page. For although Ulysses is often held up as a very serious and austere work, Joyce is certainly not afraid of humour and fun. Indeed, the reason that the book wasn't published for another 11 years in America after being published in Europe was because it is full of puerile jokes, innuendo, and sexually explicit scenes. None of this knowledge, however, makes some of the more dense sections any easier to read. However, I would say it's not a particularly fast-paced book, and so there's no shame in sort of skimming over some sections where it feels a little bit complicated to understand. There's very little chance that by the time you do get to a point where you'll feel a bit more grounded in what's going on again, that the plot will have moved on so far that you won't have any idea what's going on. Alternatively, if you're very keen not to miss out on a single sentence, then there's certainly no shame in using some guidance. There are numerous companion books to Ulysses out there. However, the one that I would recommend is Harry Blemeyer's The New Bloomsday book, where some of the guides seem to add extra stuff which just makes it more complicated. Blemeyer's book is very much just a summary of what's going on in each paragraph, which in some episodes, such as Proteus, for example, which can be a little bit confusing, just really helps to ground you in what's going on as you read. Joyce once joked that he'd packed Ulysses so full of enigmas and puzzles that it would keep professors busy for centuries deciphering it all. And as such, I don't think there's any shame in simply reading this book and not grasping absolutely every single little bit of imagery. So to conclude, I probably could have made today's video multiple hours long, discussing both the stylistic workings of Ulysses and the themes which run throughout it. This is a book which can be read on multiple levels, as a document of an Ireland straining to achieve nationhood, as a kind of treatise on what it is like to be an outsider, all sorts of different levels. Mostly today I've had to limit myself to discussing the very basics of style and plot. However, I hope some of the things we have discussed perhaps make the idea of reading Ulysses, if you haven't before, slightly less daunting. For although it can be a challenging text, and although there's this real culture of gatekeeping around it, I certainly think that it can be a really enjoyable and rewarding read. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it has been interesting in some way. As I said at the top, if you have any feedback on this first episode, then please do let me know down below in the comments. And if you think this video is a vague net positive for the world, then a thumbs up would be much appreciated. Thank you once again for watching. I always appreciate it, and have a great week.